Thank you all for standing by and welcome to our February webinar entitled Predicting Carbon Storage of Great Lakes Forests in the Year 2050, Scientific Challenges and Management Decisions. These webinars are an initiative of the Ohio State University Climate Change Outreach Team, a multi-departmental effort within the university led by Ohio Sea Grant, Office of Research, Ohio Supercomputer, OSU Extension, and 8 other OSU departments to help localize the climate change issue for Ohioans and Great Lakes residents. I am Jill Gentis-Banicki from Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Laboratory, and joining me today is Dr. Peter Curtis, professor within the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology at The Ohio State University. Dr. Curtis is the director of the Northern Forest Carbon Cycle Research Program at the University of Michigan's Biological Station, where for the past 20 years he's been studying the flow of carbon into and out of the Great Lakes forests, one of the only programs in the world that is doing this. His research is widely published on how these ecosystems will respond to rising carbon dioxide levels, how climate and land use will affect forest carbon storage, as well as the roles biological complexity of these forests will play in a changing climate. We're very excited to have him here to discuss his research today. But before we do, a few logistical issues as we get started. During our presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Afterwards, I will conduct a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will collect and pose your questions out to Dr. Curtis at the end of his presentation. We have over 100 participants in the webinar, a great diverse group representing governmental agencies, academia, and nonprofit groups from the Great Lakes and around the country. Please keep those questions coming throughout the presentation, and we should have a great Q&A session. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto our website for later viewing. Also, we will post a webinar survey in the chat feature toward the end of the hour. Please take a few minutes after the webinar to fill out that survey. It will help us continue to bring you better webinars. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Peter Curtis, who will present Predicting Carbon Storage of Great Lakes Forests in the Year 2050, Scientific Challenges and Management Decisions. Dr. Curtis, I am going to, well, you're already unmuted, and we're going to pass you the ball.
Okay, thank you, Jill.
And you should be all set.
Okay, and I think I can flip over to the webinar. Are we all looking at the first slide?
Yes, you are either today.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Jill, and thank you, everyone. Welcome to this OSU Climate Change webinar. I'm Peter Curtis, Department of Evolution, Ecology, Organismal Biology, and I'm really happy to be here and have a chance to talk to you about some of my own research, that of my group, and consider this question about scientific challenges, management decisions as they relate to the future role of our forests in the Great Lakes region as that regards carbon storage. Before I get started, I want to call attention to co-authors on this talk. My close colleagues Christopher Goff, Gil Bohr, and Newton Nadelhofer from Virginia Commonwealth University, Ohio State, and the University of Michigan, respectively. Really, the results I'm going to be talking about are the results of a big team effort, and they really come from the entire group. So, with that, let's get started. I'm going to switch to the next slide. I'd like to take just a minute or two to go over a roadmap that I'm hoping to cover in today's webinar. And I'd like to start with a bit of a discussion, really sort of an overview, a big picture overview of why carbon storage by forests is important, put this in a broader context, get us all on the same page about how this actually happens within a forest, how carbon storage takes place, and then outline why it is we're concerned about its future, to really set the stage. I'd then like to briefly consider a couple of ways that we actually project or predict what carbon storage will be like, specifically the role of modeling and then also measuring different forests that allow us to do this. I'd then like to kind of dive into the research that we've been conducting that links canopy complexity to forest carbon storage, and this will get us right down into the work that's been coming out of our group at the University of Michigan Biological Station. And then I'd like to conclude by considering management options, how we can actually manage forests to increase complexity and thereby help sustain carbon storage into the future. So that's where we're going to go if the technology serves us well. Let's see if I can do this. Well, let's get going. Okay, so let's take this overview, a big picture. Why are we concerned about carbon storage in forests? And I like this illustration. This is from Tony King down at Oak Ridge in a review paper a few years ago. And if I can get my pointer, there we go, my laser pointer. Hopefully everyone can see that on the screen. Where we often talk about sources of CO2 or CO2 sources and CO2 sinks. And in the source area, the familiar one for many of us is fossil fuel emissions. And these are places that CO2 are emitted. And but this includes things like fossil fuel emission, but also the results of, for example, land use change, deforestation, can result in CO2 emissions or represent the CO2 source, as well as other natural disturbances like pest outbreaks, and indeed the natural process of decomposition results in the release or a source of CO2. Now, this CO2, much of it ends up in the atmosphere. All of it does initially, but some of it will be taken up out of the atmosphere into what we call CO2 sinks. Now, this process of removing CO2 from the atmosphere is almost entirely driven by photosynthesis, so these producing sector sinks is where it first ends up, although the results of that, in this case, it would either come from, say, agricultural or harvested products, can be further stored in the consuming sector, as King has outlined it here. So we go from CO2 sources, like fossil fuel, to CO2 sinks, where it's stored in forests, agricultural land, and harvested products. So the activity of these sinks helps remove CO2 from the atmosphere and lessens the impact, or we hope mitigates the impact of fossil fuel emissions and climate change. Now, among these CO2 sinks, in the terrestrial biosphere, forests are thought to be the largest terrestrial sink for atmospheric CO2. So this is why we think that forests are important in the carbon cycle and storage of carbon by them. Now, how does this actually work when we're looking at a forest? And this is going to be pretty brief, but is really a primer on the forest carbon cycle using this illustration to help us. And so there are really three key points that I want to make sure people understand as you think about how forests actually store carbon, or this process of carbon storage by forests. And those key points are the following: that carbon storage or net ecosystem production, so I'll be using net ecosystem production as synonymous with carbon storage. It's sort of our technical term in ecology. But this process of carbon storage is the difference between two large processes. That is the carbon that's being taken up through photosynthesis, and so this is taking place in forest canopies, and then really the only way carbon can be taken up is through photosynthesis. But it's the difference between that process and the CO2 that is lost through respiration. And respiration can happen both from what we call heterotrophs, and this is primarily bacteria and fungi, and from the green plants themselves, or autotrophic respiration. So the key point here is that carbon storage is the difference between what's taken up by photosynthesis and what's lost by respiration. Now, it follows, and this also sort of important in understanding this, is this process can be either positive, when an ecosystem is gaining carbon, or when photosynthesis exceeds respiration, or carbon storage can be negative when an ecosystem is losing carbon, and that occurs when these loss terms, respiration, exceed photosynthesis. So carbon storage can be positive or negative, and that would indicate whether an ecosystem is gaining or losing carbon overall. And then finally, my last key point is where this carbon is actually stored, and that's the storage pools, as we call them. The ones that we're interested in here are relatively long-term. That would be years, decades, or in some cases centuries. And then where that carbon is stored is either in wood, and that would be in the stem or the roots, or in soil organic matter, soil carbon. So 3 key points. It's that the carbon storage is the difference between photosynthesis and respiration. It can be positive or negative at the ecosystem level, and most of it for forests is stored in wood or soil. Okay, so that's how it actually works. So North America, so how do forests figure into this at a broader scale? And in North America, our best estimates are that the eastern forests are currently a very important carbon sink, our eastern deciduous forests. And this is a graphic that was made by Dan Hayes, who's at Oak Ridge National Lab, as a modeler, and it shows estimates of carbon storage in different parts of the continent, North American continent, by different areas. So by forest lands, we can see here these 3 panels, croplands, other lands, and he's basing these estimates on 3 different ways of gathering data. There's inventory data, forward models, and then what are called inverse models. I'm not going to go into the details of the way these models. The inventory data, for example, is actually going out and inventorying carbon storage, for example. And this is coded, the color is coded by the dark blue areas on these maps are showing lots of carbon storage up here. If they tend down towards green, there's very little carbon storage, and areas in the map that are in orange and red are actually losing carbon, are carbon sources. So carbon sinks up here, carbon sources down here. And I just want to draw everyone's attention to these panels here, which are in broad agreement that our eastern forests typically show up as blue in this map, so indicating strong carbon sinks, or there's a lot of carbon storage going on there. So our question then, so we acknowledge that currently in 2014, our eastern forests, and in many cases these are, as we go further north, these are the deciduous forests. These are important carbon sinks. The question that we're posing is, will these forests continue to be important carbon sinks in the future? So to put another way, would we expect to see on this map these areas continue to be dark blue, or would they start to shift into the green or red? And our concern is that this would have important implications for climate change mitigation of the ecological service that these forests currently provide. So why might we be concerned that this would not continue to be the case? Why might these forests not continue to be carbon sinks? So there are 2 major reasons why ecologists are concerned about the future strength of this carbon sink or the carbon storage capacity. And the first is that our eastern forests, our Great Lakes and forests in the Northeast generally, are getting older. And this is it goes back to the legacy of the land use of our forests in the Great Lakes. I think, as many of you know, that these forests were clear-cut about 100 years ago, between 1860 and 1930, and they've been regrowing since then. But our current harvesting of these forests does not prevent the average age from increasing. We're actually cutting at below replacement levels. And so if we look at this plot here, this is data from our what's called the Forest Inventory Analysis Program from the U.S. Forest Service. And what this shows across the eastern region, it's about a 20-state region, that the average age or the median age of these forests has indeed been increasing from approximately, or actually less than 60 years in 1991 to on the order of 70. And if this process continues, we can expect to see the average age of our forests increase to where by 2050, it could be well over 100 years old. So the forests are getting older, which is a natural ecological succession. Why is this a concern then? So the forests are getting older. Well, this is what it boils down to. Now we're changing slides. That ecological theory predicts that as forests age, we should expect a steady decline in carbon storage. And this theory goes back to a seminal paper by Gene Odom in 1959. It's referenced at the bottom of the slide, called The Strategy of Ecosystem Development. And we've taken the illustration right from his paper in which he's plotted years of forest age or forest succession. And on this, he's plotted both photosynthesis, respiration here on the dashed line, the actual forest biomass, and then in the shaded region in the middle is carbon storage or net production. And what he proposed is that this period of maximum carbon storage occurs fairly early in forest succession, perhaps at age 30, somewhere between 20 and 40 years. So when a forest is still quite young, there's a period of maximum carbon storage. And this also coincides with a period of maximum wood production. However, as forests age, and particularly as they approach 80, 90, 100 years old, both wood yield or wood production and carbon storage slow down and in fact approach zero. So you can see in terms of carbon storage that the shaded area is getting smaller and smaller, so that by age about 100, we would expect there to be very little, if any, net carbon storage occurring in these forests. So if we go back to that other slide, as we see these forests age, we would expect those dark blue areas to be shifting down towards green, and that ecological service to gradually go away. So this is the concern then, is that if this ecological theory is correct, then we would expect to see actually quite rapidly now a decline in carbon storage in our Great Lakes and our northeastern forests. Okay. Now, what do we use to look forward in time? And I want to very briefly describe for people, if you're not familiar, forest growth models are sort of a typical model, and how these might be used to forecast carbon storage. And indeed, these are our most powerful, among our most powerful methods for inferring carbon storage in the future. And I've just taken this as an example. This is the so-called triplex management model, and it's actually produced by a group at the University of Quebec in Montreal. It's an excellent model, but indeed it, as well as many other growth models, include that fundamental theory of age-related declines in carbon storage within the framework of the model. And this model indeed does that, and this is typically embedded in relationships between leaf area and photosynthesis, abbreviated here GPP. And so this model, as with others, would tend to predict a decline in forest carbon storage because of these relationships. And just to illustrate that, I've just, again, I've taken another example from the literature, recent paper from a group out of the USGS in South Dakota, predicting or using a model, in this case the 4SCE model, to predict carbon sequestration in the southeastern U.S. In fact, these are coniferous forests. And this just gives you an idea. They've used this model to both establish and then validate predictions in the past and actually current, right in here, and then running the model forward, in this case to the year 2050, to predict what carbon sequestration or carbon storage would be like in different components of these forest ecosystems. And indeed, this model as well predicts a decline in forest carbon sequestration, in part due to these age-related constraints, as is embedded in the model. So these models, as well as others, and they're extremely valuable, and indeed may very well be correct for these systems, predict age-related declines. So is this where we stand? Well, I and my group have been looking at this in a variety of ways, and we've found that if we focus our attention on temperate deciduous forests, so those forests growing in the temperate zone, and that also are dominated by deciduous species which lose their leaves in the wintertime. So when we actually look at data where people have measured carbon storage, carbon net ecosystem production, which is what's graphed here, in forests of different age, we don't see the predicted decline. So that measurements of carbon storage in these forests does cast some doubt on the generality of this idea of declining carbon storage with forest age. And so in this case, my colleague Christoph and others as students have assembled data from 40 reports from measurements of 40 different temperate deciduous forests from North America, Europe, and Asia. And I'm not seeing, I hope the zero line is showing up on your screen. It disappeared on mine, but that's neutrality right there. And what we're not seeing is any consistent decline over time in these forests of different age. And so even here, out here at 200 years, these forests are still sequestering, storing significant amounts of carbon. And if we look here in the shaded area between ages of about 75 and maybe 110 or 120, there's certainly no consistent evidence for decline in carbon storage. There's some actually very high points. We have this system down here is losing carbon. This is following a clear cut, so a very young forest. And perhaps we see some high activity in young forests, but certainly no obvious and consistent evidence for decline in these temperate deciduous forests. So this certainly got us wondering whether this is in fact a general pattern across all forests, the prediction of declining carbon storage. And indeed, if we began to look at our own data, and so now I'm going to jump right into some of our data before I introduce our team. But in one particular forest, the one that we work in, about a 90-year-old forest in northern Michigan, instead of seeing a decline in forest ecosystem production or net ecosystem production, as we would predict for an aging forest like this, we saw exactly the opposite. So what I'm showing here is a 14-year record from 1999 to 2012 of net ecosystem production. And what we're seeing is that over this record, we see an actual increase in carbon storage, a significant increase, and that's what's following along the line here, rather than a decline. And this increase is occurring at the same time that the total amount of leaf, the leaf area index, leaves are actually declining somewhat as a result down here of a decline in the early successional species that have dominated the system for 100 years, the aspen and the birch. So the open symbols here are declining as these species die. And the later successional species, oak, maple, and pine, are increasing, although not at the same rate, so that overall the amount of leaf area in this forest is declining somewhat, while at the same time net ecosystem production is going up. So this was quite a head-scratcher for us, which suggests that something else is going on to maintain this sort of production. So that's really been the major theme of our research for the last, most part of the last decade. So let me introduce some of the research program, our research program, the Northern Forest Carbon Cycle Research Program at the University of Michigan Biological Station, or UMBS. I've mentioned the names before. Here's a photograph of the gang a couple of years ago. Here are the principal investigators. We also have students and other associates who are intimately involved with this. The work takes place at the Biological Station here at we call the tip of the mitt in northern Lower Michigan. And I want to be sure to voice our appreciation and acknowledge the generous support of the U.S. Department of Energy, their Office of Science, and other institutes within the DOE that have provided very generous funding and continue to fund this research, we hope, well into the future. This is the team, and talk a little bit about how we generated the data that I showed you in the previous slide. So how do we actually measure carbon storage in forests? So I'm going to take a few minutes to describe that process. So our primary instrument, the primary tool that we use for measuring carbon storage is called the so-called eddy covariance or eddy flux tower. It's illustrated here. It's about 150 feet tall, rising about twice the height of this canopy. You can see a couple of researchers on here. It's a heavily instrumented tower. It allows us to monitor the exchange, the active exchange of CO2 between the atmosphere and the forest below. And so what we're able to do is to measure the CO2 concentration on turbulent eddies of air as they mix between the atmosphere and going down and sweeping down into the canopy, and then actually on the reverse swing as well. So we can measure CO2 concentration of the air as it passes into the canopy and then as it comes back out of the canopy. And so in a very simple sense, if the CO2 concentration is higher as it goes down into the canopy than it is when it passes back from the canopy, then somewhere down here carbon has been stored. So that would indicate net uptake. The CO2 concentration is higher on the downswing than the upswing. And the reverse is also true. So if the CO2 concentration is higher when it's coming up than when it's going down, then this system is giving off or losing, on average, losing CO2. And so these measurements are taken 10 times a second, or we say at 10 hertz. And then we typically aggregate these measurements to 1 hourly averages to give us a better idea of what's actually happening. And I want to show you an example of what those kinds of data actually look like. So this is a single day's worth of data from this, what we call our flux tower. And I'll have to point out that actually in this case, negative numbers here, the blue numbers are uptake. This is what we call the meteorological convention of where when numbers are negative, it means the system is taking up CO2 somewhat counterintuitively, and positive, it's losing CO2. So this is one day. It's actually over a decade ago, July 9th of 2000. This is at night, and the system is on average losing CO2. Sun comes up. These are hourly averages, and so it picks up speed. It's gaining. It's taking up net uptake of CO2. Sun goes down. It's losing, and then it's night again, and it's as a net loss of CO2. We do these measurements 24/7, 365 days, and now we're well over a decade of continuous measurements. And this is one of about of several hundred towers which are scattered around the world, and we work within a network both in the U.S. and then internationally. So a number of these carbon cycle monitoring sites in operation. So this is our primary tool that we use for studying CO2 exchange in this forest. The so-called footprint of the tower, it goes out about 1 kilometer. So we're measuring an area of perhaps a square kilometer of forest using this technique. But we complement these studies, these measurements, with very detailed ecological studies of forest carbon storage as well. So we're interested not only in these short and longer term dynamics, but we also want to know where the carbon is ending up. So is it, for example, in the herbaceous understory layer? Is it up in the canopy? Is it in soils? And at what rate is it leaving those soils? So we're taking quite a few measurements on the ground. This is looking down at our map of one of our sites with permanent plots surrounding the tower, which is right here. So lots of studies. It's sort of like running around trying to find the missing penny. We're trying to find where that carbon is and how long it stays in these different places within the ecosystem. Okay, so that's how we take the measurements. So let's talk about some of the information that we found that shed some light on this bit of a puzzle between aging forests and increasing the sustained carbon flows. And one of the important results that we found is that in the older plots that we've studied, that they have higher complexity, structural complexity, and they also have higher wood production. I want to spend a little bit of time describing how we do this. We measure canopy complexity using a laser rangefinder, what's called LiDAR, and this is shown here. And this is my former student, Brady Hardiman, who's now at Boston University. And we use this to essentially map the vegetation above us and map the leaves. And Brady's developed a mathematical expression, which he terms rugosity, that describes that distribution of leaves above him as he's walking with this instrument, this laser rangefinder connected to a laptop computer, as he walks through the forest. And this results in images like this one, which allow us then to describe the complexity of the arrangement of leaves within that canopy. So I'm showing you three different panels, A, B, and C, from forest plots of contrasting complexity, structural complexity, but similar amounts of leaves, so similar leaf area index. So panel A has a low rugosity or low complexity compared to panel C, which has high rugosity. So we see here this number about 29, down here it's about 8. And so you can sort of see this is that each of these little boxes has to do with the amount of leaf area that's at that height. And in panel A, this forest plot, fairly uniform distribution of leaf area, the colored boxes, compared to panel C, where we see evidence for canopy gaps, emergent trees here, more well-developed mid-story and understory canopy as well. So this would be an example of walking through the forest. It's across 40 meters with this instrument of the distribution of leaves above you. A complex canopy, or rather a simple canopy up here, and a complex canopy down there. Low rugosity, high rugosity. So we developed this tool for measuring complexity, and that what Brady Hardiman found was that as forests age, as they got older, rugosity climbed steeply, and particularly during this period from about 40 or 50 years up to about 90, at which point it seemed to plateau. It seemed to even off as forests got above about 100 years. We don't have too many of these older plots. We're looking to increase that number, but certainly in this period, in this range of about 70 or 80 years, a steep increase in complexity. And overall, even including these older plots, we see a nearly exponential relationship between complexity and net primary production of wood, or carbon storage down here. So this was a key insight in these aging Great Lakes forests, that there was a relationship between complexity and carbon storage. And Brady combined all that information into a simple model in which he's relating, this is the output of the model, net primary production of wood, so carbon storage, as a function of complexity, leaf area index, or in this case, site fertility. And what he found was that rugosity was the best predictor, was the most strongly related of these variables to wood production, and that as stands aged, or as those forests aged, complexity or rugosity tended to increase. So this established the linkage, a functional linkage between complexity and wood production. And I should mention that we're now establishing what the mechanism is here. And this appears to be strongly related to resource use efficiency, particularly the way these forests use incoming light. Okay, so that was a key insight as relates canopy complexity, stand age, and wood production. So this led to an emerging conceptual model for our group that suggests that leaf arrangement, or this complexity, is more important to carbon storage than leaf quantity, than actual amount of leaves as these eastern forests age. And in this plot, I've shown the development of overall leaf area, which tends to increase quite quickly and then plateau by 50 or 60 years, while complexity takes longer to develop. So in these rapidly growing young forests, complexity is still quite low, but that this starts to increase at around age 70 or 80, and will increase rapidly to some point. We're not sure when this actually plateaus, in which case other factors may come to dominate uptake and resource use efficiency. So we suggest that this is a key dynamic here with increasing complexity and resource use efficiency in these older forests. And this is a model that we're continuing to test. And my next slide illustrates some of those efforts. This is an area of active research for us. We are continuing our efforts to better quantify the canopy structural complexity, as well as the light and nutrient environment within canopies. And I have to point out here that canopies are complex and difficult areas to work. We wish in many cases we've had a team of sort of trained squirrels or monkeys or something that could get us up into the canopy. We're using different sorts of hoists or poles. This is my student Alex Fotis, who is extending a fisheye camera into the canopy on the end of a carbon fiber pole. Here's actually Chris Goff experimenting with yet a higher pole, a taller. This is a hydraulically activated pole that will get us up to on the order of 22 meters. These are all by way of getting better descriptions of what's going on inside these canopies as they become more complex. We'd like to be able to develop full three-dimensional characterizations of canopies. This is showing a young canopy and an older canopy at our site. These are very laborious to collect, and we're looking for ways of simplifying that. Alex is interested in putting a time dimension into this. We think that actually these forests may behave differently, structurally simple ones versus structurally complex over time. So we're adding a fourth dimension, if you will, a time dimension to our characterizations to further test this model and this idea that structural complexity is so important. So that's where we're going with some of our efforts in the future. But let me now switch gears, just sort of wrap this up. Oh, actually, before I do that, I want to get to management. But I do want to mention the role of biodiversity, and I'll do this very quickly. We have this is an illustration from a paper of ours from 2010, but to point out that it's very important that species diversity, the number of species that are present, can have a big impact on resilience. And we saw this in our own system in stands in which there were many middle successional species that were co-dominant, and when those early successional species died, as is increasingly happening, that primary production, the effects of that decline, rather the death of those species, was low because these early succession, rather the mid-successional species, were there to fill in. And so where we had higher diversity, the effects of the death of the early successional species, the aspen and birch in our case, the effects were small compared to when those mid-successional species were not present. So in our case, very clearly, greater diversity equated to greater ecological resilience. But how can we put some of these, what are our possibilities for putting some of these insights into forest management and the way forests are actively managed within the forest products industry and within our state and federal lands and as we manage those? And I've modified a graph that was from Klaus Putman and his colleagues in a book on a critique of silviculture, which essentially plots different kinds of forests along axes of simple or complex, or in our case, having low or high climate change mitigation potential, as added to this, as a function of their management. So increasing management intensity here, increasing complexity on the x-axis. And so if we go from essentially an early successional forest after some stand-initiating disturbance, that could be a fire, that could be a clear cut, and then natural ecological succession would result over time, over many years, decades to centuries, in a complex old-growth forest. Our forest management, on the other hand, is generally aligned with keeping forests complexity or forest structure is simple, we can look at this along a gradient of natural regeneration, perhaps with some thinning, uneven age stand management, all the way up to clear-cut and intensive plantations. So here's an increasing management intensity, but almost always keep with the consequence of having simple structure. What we suggest is that we need ways of thinking about bringing structural complexity into our management options. And so we would argue that new management tools are needed that promote structural, compositional, and functional complexity that would then allow for greater carbon storage, for example, and as well as other benefits of structural complexity and biotic complexity in terms of ecological goods and services. So here are some challenges, and I'd like to conclude by mentioning and highlighting that there are, in fact, groups that are currently working to develop and test these management tools. And I want to take the liberty of highlighting a project that the Nature Conservancy is spearheading. And here I want to thank actually the managers, the Nature Conservancy scientists based at the Marquette office. This would be Tina Hall in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and Doug Pearsall and Kim Hall, who are down in the Lansing TNC office, who've shared some of these results with me. It's a very exciting project along the Two-Hearted River in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The site here is this left-hand icon. It's part of their forest reserve there, and it's part of a broader Forest Michigan restoration strategy. But what these scientists and managers have proposed, and they actually have a hypothesis, is that by applying forest management tools, one can more quickly obtain more naturally diverse or natural diversity of species, age classes, and structural attributes than just by waiting to see that this happens naturally. And they've done this through a series of experiments, and I've just shown here an aerial photograph of the studied site along the Two-Hearted River. And what you can see here are different cutting experiments with different sized gaps, so small, medium, and large gaps. You can sort of see these visually to see whether or not these experiments produce the same effect as we would see in naturally successional or forests that accrue natural disturbances. And so we're interested in whether or not these key ecological attributes of older forests are mimicked using some of these harvesting techniques, in this case creating different sized gaps. And so merchantable wood, harvested wood, is coming out of these gaps and can be used as you would any other sort of wood. There actually are there's a control area here and a restoration cut area here that these experiments can be compared to. So it's very exciting. These, and there are other examples of forestry professionals, conservation scientists who are actively working to test whether or not we can create complexity, enhance ecological goods and services in our managed forest lands. So very exciting, and thank you to the TNC for sharing that information. So I'm closing in on the end of this. I'd like to finish off with just a few concluding thoughts. I'm going to pass the ball over to Jill, who's going to help me with this because it wasn't working from my end when we tested it. So I'd like to just send the audience, and again, thank you for joining us, away with a few concluding thoughts. Jill, thank you. If we could have the first of those ideas that I hope I've been able to communicate, and that is that as our Great Lakes forest age, the early successional species will be leaving us. In this case, it's aspen and birch. But as they age, they become structurally and biologically more complex. Next slide, or next bullet point. This increasing complexity is a process that sustains carbon storage. It also promotes ecological resilience and enhances biodiversity. And it's an important point is that these more complex forests will also likely be able to harbor a greater diversity of organisms who might be being displaced by climate change. So I think that's an added benefit. So increasing complexity it sustains carbon storage, promotes resilience, and enhances biodiversity. And next slide. It's very important that we have the opportunity for putting in place innovative forestry management practices that may accelerate forest complexity. We may not have to wait 200 years for a complex forest to develop. We may be actually able to do this ourselves. And lastly, that with increasing complexity, carbon storage in our Great Lakes forests should not decline substantially by 2050. We hope that this there's a mechanism and that this is borne out with some of our data analysis, that indeed these areas can continue to be important carbon sinks and help mitigate climate change globally. Thank you very much for your attention. I think we have a few minutes for questions if there are any. I'll be happy to try to help respond to them.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Curtis, and we got a lot of questions. So we got some really great questions during your presentation. So let me get started, and I'll ask Dr. Curtis as many as we can. The first question, and let me, I'm going to hand you back the ball just in case you need to go to a certain slide.
Okay. All right.
All right. The first question was a clarification question. A couple of people were asking what the difference between carbon storage is as opposed to carbon sequestration.
I'm using those interchangeably. So when carbon is sequestered someplace, it's effectively stored. Sometimes it might imply a little bit longer period. I mean, so we can have short-term storage or long-term storage. I think in many cases people, when they're thinking sequestration, they're thinking, decades, perhaps millennia, but they're synonymous.
Okay. Another question we had was if you have a sense of the scale of carbon being stored currently or potentially in forested systems relative to that being emitted from fossil fuels.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Biological, so there's a tremendous amount, and I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but it's a small fraction at this point. Biological carbon sequestration and carbon storage, the majority of which we think is in forests, but there are substantial amounts going on into agricultural soils, for example. But this is a part of the solution. It is not adequate to address all of it. So we're looking at a fraction. It's not an insignificant fraction, but it's still a relatively small fraction of the total amount that's being emitted. Considerable amounts of carbon go into the oceans, of course, or other carbon sinks, although the turnover there can be quite rapid. So it's part of the puzzle. It can't solve the problem on its own by any means.
Okay, thank you. Another question we had was, and this is a general question, are there tree species that store more carbon than others?
Well, yeah, that's another good question. We have a couple of things going on here. So a rapidly growing tree will store more carbon more quickly than will a more slowly growing tree. But if you're taking the long view of this, a tree which is going to live for 300 or 400 or 500 years will hold on to that carbon a lot longer than would a tree that's like an aspen tree that has a lifespan of 100 years. So aspen early on grow quickly, store that carbon quite quickly, but they also die and fall over, and that carbon, much of that would return to the atmosphere when they decompose, right? When those tree trunks decompose. An oak tree, a red oak tree, for example, grows more slowly, but by the same token, it lives, and so in the short term, it stores carbon less quickly, certainly. In the long term, though, it's going to hold on to that carbon a lot longer. We prefer to think of the entire ecosystem And what you'd like to see is a transition between rapidly growing early successional species and then later more slowly growing species that basically take up carbon and hold on to it a lot longer. So there's two ends of that. There's simply two parts of that question. The fast-growing, short-lived species versus more slowly growing, long-lived species.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, we're getting more and more questions, so I'm trying to go through. As you're talking, there's more questions. Another question we had was dealing with how do we, and this is more of a management, we have quite a few that are like management questions, so let me go through a few of those. How do we balance the desire for old growth forests and the habitat they provide with the need for carbon sequestration?
Well, I would argue that those are completely compatible. And in fact, an important benefit or conclusion here is that old growth forests are important carbon sinks, and they continue to be. And there's a variety of kinds of evidence. Unfortunately, there are so few old growth forests left, and particularly not in temperate deciduous forests. There are just almost none. And so it's difficult to actually get a number on that. But there are a few reports out there that indicate, and as our data would suggest is the case, is that old growth forests continue to be important carbon sinks, and they continue to take up carbon. So on the one hand, this is good news. Now, what we do have to balance, of course, is the need for wood products. And so we have ongoing needs for sustainable production of forest products, and we need to very carefully balance that with our need to increase acreage of older, complex forests. And this, I think, is where it's so exciting to have management tools coming online which do balance those two things, that they can generate the complexity while also yielding a useful product, in this case, wood, from those systems, yet maintain that carbon storage capacity. That, to me, is the real challenge. I'm hopeful that in terms of aging forests, that we can remove from primary consideration that these should be cut so that we increase carbon sequestration, or rather they should be cut because they're no longer storing carbon and they're not part of that benefit. And I think our data show that ecological service, carbon storage, continues well into the hundreds of years of age. We'd like to see many more old forests out there.
Another question we got was dealing with some guidance for urban forest management. In your research, if you could give some guidance. Are there certain trees with certain leaf structure and canopies that are better to plant in urban areas in order to assist with mitigating carbon emissions and urban heat island effect? Any idea the extent to which these smaller urban stands can help with climate change mitigation? And do you need sorry, this is kind of a large question. Do you need large canopies to get more meaningful mitigation impacts, or is it worth planting area tree stands in urban areas?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And there are a number of groups now that are looking very carefully at urban forests and the role that they play. And I think the picture is becoming clear that they play quite important roles. Of course, there are a suite of challenges if you're working in urban forests that you might not have in a natural forest system. And so, large canopies that might drop limbs on people, and these sort of things are very real concerns. And so you have to manage the forest where there's going to be lots of people walking around underneath the trees in maybe a different way than you would an unmanaged forest in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. But in general, I think native species that actually have long lifespans. Now, this means they need to be resistant to pests. They need to have resistance to the sort of stressors that may be present in urban environments, but maybe less so in further away in natural areas. But long-lived trees, a diversity of them. This issue of biodiversity is very important. We never know where the next pest is coming from. There are communities which invested heavily in ash trees, for example, as their street trees, and of course now emerald ash borer is wreaking havoc with those areas. So diversity, thinking native species. I'm a big proponent of those, as well as thinking intelligently about what climate change is going to, thinking proactively about climate change. So all other things being equal, planting something that's not right now at the southern range limit, in which case it might be outside its range limit in 20 years. If you're going to plant a tree that lives to be 80 to 150 years old, you want to be sure that its climate envelope, if you will be appropriate when it's reaching those older ages. We're not just thinking in the next decade. So we'd like to have big trees that are going to live a long time and hold on to that carbon, but do think proactively about what you're planting. So maybe something that currently is at the northern or northern part of its range, so that as these ranges migrate northward with climate warming, that those trees will still continue to be well within the appropriate climate regime.
Okay, another question we had was dealing with carbon sequestration that is below ground or at ground level. That a couple people were asking that your research seems to be focusing on the living above ground pool of carbon, but a couple questions asked about research on carbon in like woody debris and standing dead snags in forests. Yeah, no, again, a very good question. We've actually spent a lot of time and effort quantifying how much carbon is going below ground, and there's a lot there in terms of production, and in the end, some of that gets stored in carbon, in soil organic matter and soil carbon. There's a lot of current interest in how carbon becomes stabilized in soils. This is particularly important for clayey soils or some more fine textured soils that are better able to form aggregates. The soils that we work on in this part of Michigan are very sandy and are a little bit simpler in that regard in terms of their ability to hold on to carbon. But absolutely, no, it's extremely important. We as these forests age, they actually are increasing the store of coarse woody debris or snags and so forth. This becomes an important pool, although it's relatively short-lived, depending on the species. An oak log will remain on the forest floor longer than an aspen log. But we're in the process of calculating exactly how much carbon will be returned to the atmosphere following the death, for example, of these early successional aspen species. So not disturbing soil is a great way of releasing the carbon in it. In fact, it's a key element of forestry, minimizing the disturbance to soil so that carbon that does become sequestered, that does become protected within the soil environment. And that's really where it will remain the longest. When soil's there, it has the potential for remaining there for centuries, if not longer, but really mostly if it doesn't get disturbed. And so that dynamic of how carbon gets into the soil, fairly slow process in forests, but then how it gets protected and what we need to do to keep it there, very, very important research questions and an active area of research by our group as well as others. Excellent questions. I have two more questions. I don't mind being on a bit longer.
No, by all means.
The next question we had was, do we know if a warmer climate in the future will adversely affect and stress our immediate and old-growth forest species? And if so, which more southern trees are logical replacements for the species which might be affected?
Well, we have a lot of, well, I'll try to get the first one. I mean, with climate change and old-growth forests, with rapidly increasing temperatures, this is going to stress all of our systems and natural systems. I would posit that a complex old forest. Let me back up. But old forest, a forest that's lived for 300 years, 200, 300, 400 years, has seen a lot of climate change. So trees are a mature tree is a robust and organism that actually has a considerable ecological climate amplitude if it's, if it's healthy. So that as complexity increases, as I mentioned, resilience also goes up. And so we would argue that old-growth forests are more complex. They should have greater ecological resilience. Now, of course, that resilience only goes so far. But our feeling is that these complex older systems will, in fact, be better able to continue functioning, continue to provide ecological goods and services in the face of a warming climate than would more simple systems. So with biodiversity, complexity comes resilience. So that's the first part. Now, thinking about southern species, you don't have to, we have a whole raft of southern oak species, for example, or oaks that have more southern distributions. Chestnut oak, for example, is here, but it's distributed well into the south. Tulip tree, Liriodendron, again, it grows well here, but it has a primarily southern distribution. These would be certainly candidate species to think about, ones which do well, species which do well in the south. I wouldn't, necessarily be planting southern pine all over the place. So it's an interesting problem, and I think there are urban foresters, there are modelers. There's a very active group out of the U.S. Forest Service Delaware office here. Lewis Iverson and others have thought a lot about species migration, and I'd point folks to their the resources they have there at the Forest Service to think about that. But we're fortunate to have quite a few eastern species. It has a high level of biodiversity, and we should think about that. But avoid species whose primary distribution is north of here. It would only make sense.
Okay, thank you. The last question is, could you talk a little bit about the role and impact of selective or clear cutting in the capacity of carbon storage?
So those are two different things, of course. I mean, although selective cutting might sweep in a whole variety of approaches, including perhaps gap creation or other kinds of cuts short of clear cutting. But the clear cut is an easier one. I mean, there are a whole variety of reasons, almost all of them economic, why this is as prevalent as it is. But it's very problematic when it comes to carbon storage for a number of reasons. But the disturbance that usually comes along with that is part and parcel of it. And there are arguments that this may mimic fire and other stand-initiating disturbances. And I don't want to get too far into that argument, but clear cutting and then the response to that, which is typically, again, even age stands, makes it very difficult to generate appropriate levels of complexity with clear cuts. On the other hand, selective cutting, if we go into that with an idea of mimicking and promoting complexity, I think we can achieve quite a bit. The amount of data out there is fairly small at this point, which is why I think demonstration projects like the one on the Two-Hearted River are going to be so important. Can we actually do this? In the way it sounds good on paper, we need large-scale demonstrations that this is possible and economically feasible before I think we're going to see large-scale adopting of those approaches. But having said that, there are quite a few other selective cutting regimes out there which also might be put into play. We need to study them more.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Curtis. This has been very interesting. I would like to, since we're a little over time, I'd like to wrap up if we could. I wanted to, again, thank you, Dr. Curtis, for your willingness to talk with us today about your research on carbon storage. Really an excellent discussion. Also, a thank you to Ohio State University, National Sea Grant College Program, and Ohio Supercomputer for funding this webinar. I did want to remind everyone that our survey URL for this webinar is in the chat feature, so please take a few minutes to fill that out. I also want to refer you to resources and an archive of all the previous webinar presentations, which are located on our changingclimate.osu.edu website, as well as our new regional site at greatlakesclimate.com. This webinar series is sponsored by the OSU Climate Change Outreach Team and will continue next month with registration up soon. We'll keep you posted. Thank you again to Dr. Curtis and all the participants on this webinar. We hope that this was beneficial and hope you'll join us again in an upcoming webinar. Thank you again, Dr. Curtis, and everyone have a great week. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Jill. Thanks to everybody for attending.
Thank you.